12 days of war between Israel and Iran have ended in a fragile ceasefire. Some have criticized China's cautiousness in directly supporting Iran during the attacks, while others claim the war exposed the limits of Beijing's foreign policy. We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. China calls on NATO to abandon their Cold War mentality. In a press conference June 26, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun advised NATO leadership to examine their behavior and let go of their Cold War mentality, block confrontation, and zero-sum approach, claiming that his country only seeks to uphold its sovereignty, security, and development interests and continue to do its part to make the world a more peaceful and stable place. The comments were in response to NATO raising military expenditure for member countries to 5% of their GDP from the current 2%, and Secretary General Mark Rutte's remarks that this increase was necessary in order to face alleged long-term threats posed by China and Russia at last week's NATO summit held in The Hague. At the summit, Rutte also accused China of aiding Russia in its war by providing weapons and technological support. Guo denied these claims, calling them a disinformation campaign. NATO's eastward expansion was one of the reasons cited by Russia for launching its special military operation in Ukraine in 2022, and the military bloc has recently been attempting to expand its reach in the Asia-Pacific by proposing military collaborations with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Heavy rain hit China's southwestern Guizhou province once again on Saturday, half submerging the already flood-stricken riverside city of Yongong and forcing the evacuation of residents to higher ground. This follows the evacuation of over 80,000 people after floods swept the province just last week. With floodwaters receding later Saturday night, teams from Guiyang, the provincial capital, and neighboring counties joined local crews to clear debris. In addition, over 1,000 soldiers from the Guizhou Provincial Corps of the People's Armed Police Force were sent with heavy machinery to strengthen relief efforts. Also on Saturday, China's National Development and Reform Commission announced that following an initial emergency allocation of 100 million yuan, or just under $14 million, it would provide Guizhou with an additional 100 million from the central budget to support restoration of infrastructure and public services. President Trump has announced he's found a buyer for TikTok. Speaking on Fox News on Sunday, Trump stated that a group of very wealthy people were interested in the ByteDance-owned social media app, but that the deal was subject to approval by Chinese President Xi Jinping, and details won't be released for another 2 weeks. Trump earlier said he would extend for the third time a deadline for ByteDance to sell the U.S. portions of TikTok, which would give the company 90 days beyond June 19th. The deal has largely been stalled, with U.S. China trade relations swept up in larger tensions over tariff negotiations. Washington and Beijing have signed a trade agreement that will make it easier for U.S. firms to obtain magnets and rare earth minerals from China. This is according to an announcement made by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Friday. After Trump announced his 145% tariffs on Chinese goods back in April, Beijing responded by implementing export controls on rare earths, upending supply chains central to the weapons industry, automakers, and semiconductor companies. This follows a meeting between U.S. and Chinese officials in London a few weeks ago, where the two agreed upon a framework for trade talks to continue. That is, China would lift export controls on some rare earths, and in exchange, Trump would cease trying to revoke the student visas of Chinese international students on U.S. campuses. China is temporarily shutting down AI tools ahead of its nationwide Gaokao college entrance exams. Popular AI apps, including Alibaba's Qwen and ByteDance's Dabao, have stopped picture recognition features from responding to questions about test papers, while other apps have suspended photo recognition services entirely during exam hours. The rigorous multi-day Gaokao exams are taken by more than 13 million Chinese students in June, each fighting to secure one of the limited spots at universities across the country. Students are already banned from using devices like phones and laptops during the hours-long tests, so the disabling of AI chatbots serves as an additional safety net to prevent cheating during exam season. The increasing availability of chatbots is a major issue across universities and has made it easier than ever for students around the world to cheat their way through education. Some schools in the US are trying to address the issue by reintroducing paper tests. Well, the fragile ceasefire between Iran and Israel remains in place. This follows a 12-day war in which Israel killed Iran's top military commanders along with over 900 civilians, and the US hitting 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities. From the start, China condemned Israel's unprovoked attacks, which ignited the fighting and called for de-escalation, but has exercised a degree of caution that has left some to point to the limitations of its foreign policy. To discuss this, we are so honored to have on Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an author, historian, journalist, and the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, welcome to the China Report.
Yeah, great to be with you. Nice to be with you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to get started with this Chatham House report that I read yesterday. They argued that the 12-day Iran-Israel war exposed China's lack of leverage and general weaknesses in its policy, that it had no influence over Israel, and that China's risk-averse response may indicate its mediation style is ineffective in the context of this active Middle Eastern conflict. Those are the report's words. And I know we talk a lot about China's policy of non-intervention here, but there is a lot of frustration also among people who have been helplessly watching this genocide unfold in Gaza over the past couple of years. And, you know, they may wonder why China didn't do more to directly come to Iran's aid, you know, whether it be providing military support, or at least stop trading with Israel, right? So I'm curious, can you address these two responses and talk about the factors at play here that may play into China's cautiousness? You know, how much of its policy around Iran was pragmatism, like not wanting to jeopardize its relations with the West and the GCC, its BRI investments across the Gulf and the Middle East, or not wanting to disrupt its oil supplies?
Well, I think the first thing to pay attention to is that Iran might not have wanted any help. Iran is a country of 90 million people, a very old continuous civilization that goes back to the earliest recorded memories of humans. They are a very proud people. They are proud of their abilities, their government, in a sense, even if they may disagree with this or that policy. They are a very proud people. I mean, they may not want somebody to come in and help them if they feel they can help themselves. In fact, until the United States bombed Iran, and that was really, it seems, not a very serious attack by the US government, it was even Stevens between Iran and Israel. You know, just as between India and Pakistan, the 3-day air war, where it became very clear that the 4.5 generation weapon systems make both India and Pakistan basically, in a draw-like situation. I mean, it proved that China has incredible weapon systems that rival those of the West, maybe even best them. But there was no real victor in the India-Pakistan air war. In the same way, between Iran and Israel, there was no real victor. You know, neither side was able to prevail. Air defense systems remained intact. Iran was able to hit Israel very hard. I mean, they may not have wanted assistance. So I don't see why that's not part of the debate and discussion. You know, maybe Iran wanted to prove it could defend itself. It did that. China's cautiousness, the word you used, is a very good word. I think is real. I mean, look, China understands it's favoring peace and development. That's what it favors. But the last thing China wants right now is for the United States to feel like it should attack Beijing or Shanghai or whatever, you know, or that it should place mid-range nuclear weapons in Taiwan. These are serious issues for the Chinese. They don't want to provoke the United States into an action like that. So unless there is a clear, need for Chinese intervention, And even then, I'm not sure that the cautiousness will be overcome. I don't see China intervening easily. I mean, in this case, I don't think it's a question of China. I think Iran simply said we can deal with this ourselves.
Mm. Well, I was also reading this interesting essay by Arnaud Bertrand, and he makes the argument that China is actually helping Iran and Palestine by not stepping in, that it can be a better help by being an outside neutral broker. And he cites the examples of the rapprochement that China brokered between the Saudis and Iran, as well as convening the 14 Palestinian factions last year to sign the Beijing Declaration. And he argues that if China gets involved in Gaza, then that becomes this greater proxy war between the U.S. and China, and the public starts seeing the Palestinians as pawns in this geopolitical, chessboard, in this great power competition, rather than victims seeking justice. And in the case of military intervention in Iran, Iran would just be dragged into escalations beyond their control and conflicts that serve others' interests other than their own. And, then there's the matter of Taiwan and reunification. If China gets caught up in these distant military ventures, then that gives the U.S. justification to increase its military encirclement of China, which obviously wouldn't be of any benefit to them. So I guess I'm wondering your thoughts on this line of argument that the China of today isn't the Soviet Union. It's not even the China like during Mao, where they sent soldiers to support these national liberation movements, nor should it be, right? That this argument that the China of today is far more powerful and can wield more influence over the long term as a third party above the military fray.
Yeah, well, let's take military support and consider the Palestinian question. There is no airport in Gaza that the Chinese could send long-range jet fighters into. There is no place to land. There is no place to land in the West Bank. I mean, the Israelis have made sure of that. There used to be an airport in Gaza, the Yasser Arafat Airport near Rafah, but that has been destroyed a long time ago. So there's no way for China to get aerial, build an air bridge into Gaza and then, let's say, release soldiers in there. There's just no way to do that. I mean, Russian aircraft, military aircraft landed in Damascus airport in 2015. That just is not possible with the Palestinians. It's not been possible since, I would say, the first Intifada in the 1980s. Secondly, when this genocide began, the United States effectively blockaded the Eastern Mediterranean. So no Chinese ship would have been able to go up to the shoreline of Gaza. It's just impossible without a direct confrontation with the US Navy, in the Mediterranean. So would China, which is, as I said, a defensive power, doesn't have the military strength with a forward policy that the United States has. The United States has 900 military bases around the world. The Chinese have basically none. There's a base in Djibouti, but that's not a aggressive military base. That's to support a UN mission against piracy. So would the Chinese government have been willing to confront the US, in the Mediterranean, have a direct clash? I don't think that would have been good for the world, let alone for the Palestinians. It wouldn't have helped anything. So I just think that the idea that, well, why can't the Chinese do something militarily, is naive, unless you want the Chinese government to go to war with the United States to stop the genocide of the Palestinians. I think there's something naive in that. We don't understand the geography of the genocide. And then when it comes to diplomatic maneuvers and support, I think, the Chinese have been doing what they can. Obviously, one would like to see more. For instance, I would like to see more, convenings of the UN Security Council, more resolutions put forward that force the United States to veto them, to show that it's entirely complicit in the genocide. I would like to see more of that. I'd like to see much more Chinese pressure, let's say, against companies. Today, Francesca Albanese has released a report which is called from the economy of occupation to the economy of genocide. Very important report from the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur on Palestinians. Francisca Albanese's team has done some terrific research. They show the complicity, what she calls the enablers of the genocide, these corporations. Maybe the Chinese government picks one or two of these corporations that do business in China and says, get out of China. You are a genocide enabler. All of that would be great. I would like to see that happen. It's not happening. One must call for it to happen. I think that there is space. There are some things the Chinese government can do, but one should not say, well, I'm disappointed they don't send in the military. That's simply not possible in this genocide. I mean, you want to put pressure on anybody, put it on the US government to stop being a co-participant in the genocide. You can't stop the Israeli government right now, but, much more pressure on Europe, on the US government and so on would be great. I just don't think the Chinese or the Brazilians or the South Africans can do more than they're doing, maybe a little bit more here and there.
Mm. Well, I want to play this clip to get your reaction. This was from a Council on Foreign Relations panel a couple of weeks ago with Ariana Schuyler Mastro. She's a professor of political science at Stanford now, but before that, she was a top strategic analyst at the Department of Defense for the Indo-Pacific Command. So in this clip, she talks about her work in the Pentagon and getting impatient with officials because they could never fully make the full pivot to Asia. They could never fully commit to confronting China because we'd always get embroiled in all these other military adventures that would kind of suck up the resources away from a war with China. And she contrasts it to China's foreign policy, where they exercise more of what she calls strategic discipline, and they don't overextend themselves militarily the way that we do. So yeah, if we can play this clip.
And here we are in 2025. And I have to tell you, as someone who has worked on strategy and plans, and if I can toot my own horn, I've won 2 Officer of the Year awards for my ability to do strategy and plans. It's not that hard. Just do it. Just stop doing this other stuff and pivot towards Asia and focus on Asia, right? So while we are sitting over here, I can tell you, I would love it if the United States could do everything. Like, let's go build that Golden Dome that's going to be useless, and let's go march in the streets of DC. Let's do it all, but we do not have the resources, right? The United States spent more on its nuclear weapons than China spent on its whole military since 2006. And so while we sit in these defense circles and we pat ourselves on the back about how we won the Cold War because we convinced the Soviets to spend money and do stupid things, how can we then say in the same breath, maybe we should deploy troops again to the Middle East to fight this war? And so for me, we've run out of time. I've had policymakers say to me, Oriana, we're just going to do this. We're just going to do this first, and then we're going to do this. Meanwhile, China has been very strategically disciplined. They do not believe in foreign military intervention as a tool of power. They want to dominate Asia militarily, and we're going to talk about that on this panel. And a lot of people would consider me a China hawk because of my writings on that issue. But when it comes to the rest of the world, they're focused on using political and economic tools. Now, we might sit here and look at them and say, oh, that's not possible. Sure, wouldn't it be nice if you could protect your interests without sort of gunboat diplomacy? But the truth is they've done it successfully for 30 years. And, leaving judgment aside, the war in Afghanistan cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives. So which one is more impactful on the world? And so it's very difficult. The Chinese, they sit over there and they're just like, we want to stay out of it. Even with Iran, when you see people are talking about the autocratic quad of Iran and North Korea and Russia, and when I talk to the Chinese about it, they do not want that block because they understand they want to have their cake and eat it too. They have close relationships with those countries that give them strategic leverage. But their most important economic relationship is with Europe, right? The strategic relationship is with the United States. And so I have often tried to articulate recommendations to drag them into these things. And in a recent foreign affairs piece, I said when it came to Iran and others, we should start punishing China for the misbehavior of some of their friends. And when I talked to party officials about it, they read that article because everyone reads foreign affairs. And they said to me, Oriana, we hate this thing you wrote. I said, but why? I said, you didn't want this autocratic bloc. Isn't that nice? And they said, yeah, but you said we should suffer for how the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Russians behave. We don't like that, right? So the global order is going to be shaped by the fact that they're going to continue to compete efficiently and effectively moving forward while we continue to do 100 things at the same time. And that's how great powers decline.
Yeah, so your thoughts, your immediate thoughts.
Well, I was struck by a two-sentence contradiction that followed each other. She first said, I think quite accurately and correctly, that China doesn't believe in foreign intervention. I think that's a pretty accurate statement. We haven't seen Chinese foreign military intervention anywhere, and China has always condemned foreign military interventions. Indeed, China condemned the Russian entry into Ukraine when it happened in 2022. But then the next sentence, she said, China wants to dominate Asia militarily. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you dominate Asia militarily if you don't believe in foreign military intervention? So I don't understand what she's talking about. Right now, China is the largest trading partner with almost all the Asian countries. China is the largest trading partner with Australia and New Zealand. It need not dominate these countries. It's the largest trading partner. If these countries want to do something different, they are well within their powers to do different things. If they want to prevent China from importing their raw materials, as Indonesia has said about nickel, they are welcome to process their nickels. In fact, the Chinese government has said, we'll help you process the nickels. They've said in Africa, we'll help you industrialize. Why? Because China does not want to continue to be an importer of raw materials. It wants to move to the next generation, what it calls the new quality productive forces. So this idea, of China wanting to dominate the world at the same time, because she is, partly an informed person, at the same time as she says that it doesn't believe in foreign military intervention, strikes me as peculiar. I mean, if a country doesn't believe in foreign military intervention, one should salute that and not be threatened by it. Why would you want to punish China for trading? You want capitalism. You believe in Adam Smith. You believe in the free market. Well, get your act together and make things. Compete with China. Become the leading trading partner of South Korea again. Become the leading trading partner of Japan again. But you can't do it. That's the problem. Why can't the West do it? Because it's allowed the billionaires off the hook. They don't pay tax. They don't invest in their society. They are not captured by any desire to have long-term investments. They want to make a lot of money. The Jeff Bezoses spend tens of, billions of dollars doing nonsense, huge marriage with foam and so on luxury yachts. I mean, you don't see things like that in China. And China is different. In China, there is no capitalist class. There are individual capitalists, but they are not able to form a class. It's a different kind of society. So you don't have that problem in China. You have investments happening in the country. And the second problem you have in the West is because you've outsourced so much manufacturing, your labor force no longer remembers how to work in factories. You're going to have to train entire generations. And in a sense, that's what the Trump and other people's agenda has been. They want to cut, for instance, diversity, equity, education. They want to cut Asian studies. They want people to go out there and get ready to go work in factories. That's effectively what they're doing. They want to discipline the working class in the United States. In fact, this professor is wrong, and Obama was wrong. There isn't a pivot to Asia. In fact, what Trump is doing is a pivot to America. He wants to make the US working class compete against the Chinese. Well, good luck with that. I mean, genuinely good luck. It's a lot better to pursue that strategy than the strategy of bombing China into surrendering. Nobody wants to see the second round of the first and second opium wars. And I can tell you one thing, the Qing dynasty might have, bowed down before the British out of fear. But I don't think this Chinese government, led by the Communist Party, now over 100 million members, this Communist Party-led government is not going to surrender. They've refused to, fiddle with their currency to benefit the United States. They're not going to surrender. They've said we believe that we have a right to development. Well, compete with them economically. Why are you threatening them militarily? If anybody has threatened anybody in the world, it's the United States with its hundreds of military bases and so on. China has no military bases in the Americas, but the United States has so many military bases in Asia. I mean, I would say to this professor, hands off Asia. Why are you spending so much time trying to figure out China? Why don't you spend some of that time trying to figure out the United States?
Mm. I think another thing that struck me was when at the end she said that she admitted that the overextension of these U.S. military resources around the world was leading to its decline and that the U.S. is declining. And it made me try and situate that into the Tricontinental report that was released last year about hyperimperialism. And in that report, it said there's a clear and present danger that imperialism will continue its militarist path and rely on its military dominance to offset its growing relative economic and political decline. So, I mean, the way that she made it sound like the U.S. is on its decline and it's going to happen soon. But hyperimperialism makes it seem like this is like a new stage of imperialism. So, and one that will, is in decline, but will drag the rest of the world down with it in a really dangerous and decadent way. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain that or expound on that.
Well, I would really like to, because I think you've done this really well to show me that clip, which of course would get my blood boiling, and then ask me to calm down with talking about our text. But look, the professor, I'm sorry I don't know her name, really misses the point here, because when she says that the United States spends all this money, so many Belt and Roads could have been built by the US to its advantage and so on, she's making a couple of points which I think are completely against the facts. And I think in our report, we put the facts pretty clearly. So the first thing that she is not recognizing is it's actually not US military spending that's preventing the United States from building, its own kind of Belt and Road, of the United States from competing with China economically. The issue isn't military spending. The issue is the fact that its capitalist class has been freed no longer to pay tax. As I said, they just take, trillions of US dollars and park them in offshore assets and so on. They buy whatever consumer goods they want, and then the rest of it is all in financial markets. They are not going to invest anything. Okay, so that's the primary issue. It's capitalism, not militarism. That's the fundamental problem. She thinks it's militarism. Mm-hmm. She thinks if you just dial back the military, you'll get back US dynamism. No, you need a capitalist class, actually, that's willing to take risks, not a capitalist class that just wants to make money. These people aren't even entrepreneurs. They are rent seekers. Almost all the big US oligarchs are rent seekers. They are not risk takers. You're just not going to get that. And interestingly, in China, the risk is sometimes taken by the public sector. The high-speed rail miracle, which our recent publication, Wenhua Zhongheng, an essay by Meng Zhe, shows, the high-speed rail miracle happens because the government constructed a market out of various, state-owned enterprises. I mean, that was the very interesting way in which it enticed risk and competition within the state sector, not in the private sector. So it's capitalism, not militarism. That's the first point. The second point is, of course, she's right that an enormous amount of money is spent on the US military. It spends over 50% of the world's military budget, probably 60%, by the end of it. Yeah. enormous, obscene amounts of money. But this is rational because if you can't compete, if you just cannot compete with China economically, you have to intimidate China militarily in order to maintain your dominance. You have to somehow try to tell the Chinese, listen, you got to stop selling Huawei phones in Africa. The US succeeded. They got their allies in Europe to basically expel Huawei. They got their Canadian allies to arrest the daughter of the founder of Huawei and hold her in Canada. I mean, this is all ridiculous. Everybody knows the attack on Huawei wasn't an attack on Huawei. It was the US trying its best to work on behalf of Apple and so on so that they continue to maintain their market share. So it's actually militarism that is logical, that if you can't build a capitalism that is dynamic, then you're going to have the militaristic strategy. So the professor gets it all mixed up. The problem is not the militarism. The militarism actually is the solution if you don't have a solution within the terms of capitalism. And that's what the US is struck with. It's sort of decadence, is that there are no ideas once you don't have a dynamic capitalism. Once your capitalism is effectively rent seeking, then you turn to the military to give you an advantage. And that's what the US is doing. The only way out of this, in my opinion, is for the United States to say, look, we can live with China. I mean, China has a right to development. Why can't China also be a major power in the world? Why can't there be 10 major powers, 15, 100, 194, for God's sake? Why not every country be a major power?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good segue into talking about BRICS and multipolarity, which I also want to ask you about. I feel like 2.5, 3 years ago, people were very, very optimistic about the rise of multipolarity and BRICS' potential to challenge Western hegemony, especially seeing China's rise as a superpower, as an economic superpower. But that was before the genocide in Gaza. And what the genocide has shown is that the US empire is maybe not quite as close to collapsing as others, as some may have hoped for. And BRICS countries aren't really able to restrain the US-Israel alliance or come to the defense of its members. So, I mean, we're almost 2 years into the Gaza genocide. It doesn't really seem to be slowing down, and the devastation is just unimaginable. So, I mean, how do you evaluate multipolarity now, like given all that, and given the optimism surrounding it just a few years ago? How has the balance of forces, have they really changed?
Well, I mean, this is a very tough question because we're in the middle of major changes in world affairs. The first thing is, in 2009, when the BRICS was formed as a body, it was effectively a trade body. These were large countries in the global south that understood that the markets in the United States and Europe after the big credit crisis in the North Atlantic states, you remember the housing crisis in 2007 and 8. After that, these countries felt, look, we need to trade with each other more. We can't rely on US and European markets for our goods and services. So the initial BRICS was basically a commercial trade venture. And there was some pushing and prodding at the edges on politics, for instance, permanent seats at the United Nations, and so on. But even here, there was a lot of disagreements. I mean, China was not sure and continues to be not sure about India getting a permanent seat at the Security Council. There is no permanent Latin American seat. There is no permanent African seat. These issues were on the table, but nobody really was putting them forward, banging away. Why isn't there an African country with a permanent seat at this? Have you heard anybody? No, it's not a big issue. Over the course of the last decade, particularly, as matters have got more and more uneasy, the United States really going crazy, the pivot to China. I mean, What pivot to China? That was in 2011, 2 years after the BRICS was formed. What was the United States? What did they want to do? You want to blow things up? The BRICS got a little more active at that time. There was a little more concern about militarism. There was concern about, for instance, the bombing of Gaza in 2014. The BRICS felt the need to make a statement about that, and so on. And you began to see the BRICS position itself as a bloc of peace and development, as against the Western bloc of war and austerity. There was this, slight disagreement between the BRICS and the global North on these issues. Yeah. But it wasn't some major break, because even when the BRICS created a new development bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, when they tried to develop an alternative to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it was called a contingency reserve arrangement, didn't really take off. But all of these instruments were not so different than the Western instruments. They were not completely detached from Western financial systems. It's when the West started to sanction everybody, particularly Russia and even China. And, when Trump first went after China with the trade war, these countries began to understand the world differently. Like, if we're going to get attacked by the West, if we're going to get thrown out of the international financial system by the West, we've got to build our own stuff. So they started actually to accelerate some of these processes. The term multipolarity comes from American political science, which likes these binaries between unipolarity, I don't think these are useful. I don't think there really ever was a unipolar system. I think the United States attempted to become unipolar, but even then, there were always so-called rogue states that were not obeying the great master. There was always Cuba and there was Venezuela. And these countries had said, we don't agree with your system. We're not going to accept it. So these terms from US political science shouldn't be taken uncritically and just used. I don't think the BRICS wants to establish a multipolar order. What they want is a more balanced international order. They want a multilateral system, where the United Nations is the core body and you multilaterally deal with problems and so on. Not that there's a US pole and a Chinese pole and nobody wants that. That's the worst way to think about world affairs. The Chinese certainly don't want to create a Chinese pole. They want to be part of a multilateral system, a multilateral international system, United Nations Charter at the center of it. So these terms, I don't know where they actually came into popular discourse, but they are kind of nerdy US political science terms, which I completely don't use, and I think they are really not relevant to the actual developments taking place in the world. So I think there are great changes happening. There is an attempt by these countries to push for a more multilateral system, but they have their contradictions between each other. Things are not so easy. Many of them don't get along. They have very different political systems. China is led by a communist party. India has been, since 2014, led by a right-wing political party. Russia is led by a patriotic bloc, but it's not a left-wing bloc. These countries are all different. Brazil oscillated between the center-left and the far-right. I mean, what are we talking about? Yeah, they don't have the same political viewpoints. Very difficult for them, to just come together and be like, hey, listen, let's create a pole. It's not going to happen like that.
Well, maybe to end, I guess I'd like your final thoughts on whether or not the Israel and Iran ceasefire will hold. And, what are your predictions for the region?
Well, I very much hope that the ceasefire will hold. It's in nobody's advantage to start firing missiles at each other. But I'll tell you something that I believe, and I say this with some realism, but also not with enthusiasm, that I think within a few months Iran is going to say they have a nuclear weapon. And I think Myanmar is going to say they have a nuclear weapon, and perhaps Saudi Arabia will say it has a nuclear weapon. Why? Because these countries have figured out that there are basically two choices. There is the road of Libya, where Libya said we're going to give up our nuclear weapons, and then the state and society was destroyed by bombardment. They just didn't care. They bombed the whole country, yeah? And the country has not recovered. That bombing took place a decade ago. The country has not recovered. Nobody wants that. And the other example is North Korea. Because, whatever one thinks of North Korea, it cannot get attacked. It has nuclear weapons. It has submarine delivery capabilities for nuclear weapons, the most difficult to defend against. Nobody is going to attack North Korea. I mean, I bet the military in Myanmar was on the phone with North Korea during this conflict saying, send us a bomb, send us a couple of missiles. I think Iran is going to declare this was not a war for non-proliferation. The Israelis conducted a war for nuclear proliferation. And for many countries, poorer countries, a nuclear weapon is cheaper than conventional weapons. In the long term, you just need 5-10 warheads and a bunch of missiles, and you're set. You don't need to use them. You have them. Rather than build a large standing army and buy all kinds of equipment, which may not be able to defend against the United States anywhere or against a regional adversary. So I really fear, as I said, I say this with realism, but not with enthusiasm, that I think you're going to get a lot of nuclear weapons in the next couple of years. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just going to happen. And the Israelis will be responsible for it.
Mm. Well, Vijay Prashad, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining the China Report. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for the China Report.
In the Judah Canyon in Daibo Town, Saigon City, a married couple performs a death-defying high-altitude tightrope walk to stunned onlookers. Lei Guangwei and his wife Lei Xiaoying are part of a tightrope performance troupe. They ride unicycles, perform tricks, and do acrobatics along a thin wire stretching 300 meters or 984 feet above the gorge. They perform 5 times a day, walking the 260-meter-long rope each time. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.